Hello Stitchy friends, it's Shari. Today's project is a Floral Americana banner, but you could use this design for any kind of banner. So I am going to spell out 1776, so I need two sevens, using the statement numerals. And then I'm going to use the garden trimmings dies to decorate these numbers with a floral detail. So for each of these, there is a stitching guide that shows you where to put all the flowers and the leaves, and I'll show you how I stitch those up here in just a little bit. I'm also adding a star to each end of my banner using the nautical details. So you want to use the basic star, and then you're going to cut out the details die. This only cuts those interior holes, and this is what you're going to get. And that's going to give you a guide where to add each of these little detail pieces on each of the points of the star. Additionally, I'm going to make my nautical stars match my floral details on my numbers. Instead of using the little detail that's provided with the nautical star, I am going to use the flower details from the garden trimming set. Now let's talk about the colors for my banner today. I'm using Sapphire, Dewdrop, and Sea Spray. Dewdrop is really for the stars. I did not use that on the numbers. And Sea Spray is my leaves that I use for my flowers. For the flowers, I'm using two shades of pinky red, so I have cardinal and ripe raspberry. I'll use Paloma for the centers, and then for my white, I'm using pearl. So here is my color palette for my project today. Now for each of my numbers, I need to cut out the garden trimmings detail that fits onto that number. And what I did with my dies is I actually numbered them. So on the stitching guide, there are 5 different arrangements. I numbered them 1 through 5 on my sheet of paper, and then I numbered my dies. So for the number 7s, I'm using the first one on the stitching guide, and obviously these are going to go straight down that straight piece of the 7. Now what you do want to make sure is that the die is not going to cut any holes that interfere with your outside stitching holes. So the flower petals, it's okay if it overlaps the outside edges, but where the leaves and those lazy daisies are going to be, you want to make sure that they are all inside your outside perimeter. So once I have this figured out where it's going to be, I will run this through my die cut machine, and this is going to cut my guide holes for that arrangement of flowers and leaves and petals. Now for the 6, there are a couple different places I could put this little arrangement because it kind of curves around. And what I did was I pulled in my other numbers so I could kind of see where all the flowers were, and it felt a little more balanced when I put it over here onto the right side. So that's where I'm going to cut it out for the 6. And again, I'm just shifting it around and fine-tuning its position so I make sure that any of my holes I have to stitch something in does not interfere with my perimeter holes that stitch the 6 together. So I've cut all of my guide holes on all of my numbers. The fronts of my numbers are cut from sapphire felt, and those lighter color numbers you see there from the dewdrop felt, that's going to be the back side. And then I'm going to actually put a cardstock sandwich in the middle to give them some stability. But before we do all of that, we need to stitch on all of our little floral details here. So I'm going to start with the little leaves, and these are basically stitched with 3 long stitches. All of the stitches for all of these are on the stitching guide that you get with the dies, so it's very helpful to have that stitching guide. I'm starting out with the leaves first, and I'm actually going to stitch everything on one side of the flower before I go over and stitch everything on the other side. And I'm tying it off after I've stitched my first leaf on. And you can see it was those long stitches that all came from the bottom hole up to the other holes. The next thing I'm going to do is stitch some running stitches where the little bud is going to be. So I'm creating the stem, starting kind of where the center flower is going to be, doing a running stitch up to the stem, and the little bud is a little bud here and a little green piece that overlaps it. And you're basically going to stitch this sort of like a Y shape. So I'll stitch into one side, come back up through the hole where that one started, and stitch into the other side. And now my little bud is held in place with that kind of Y-shaped stitch. Then I will continue my running stitch back down towards where my little stem started. This is a pretty short little stem, it's only about 2 stitches. While I'm down here, what I'm going to do is stitch up beside it. You can see those holes there. That is a vine that is all stitching. So I'm doing my running stitch. I'm going to stitch the stem first, the whole thing, from the base where I started up to the end and back down, completing an entire line of stitches. So once I get down to the bottom, you can see I have a whole line there. And then the next thing I'm going to do is do the little lazy daisy stitches that create the little vine look. So I'm just kind of paying attention to where I start my stitch. I'm looking at my stitching guide, which is off camera, and I'm going to come up through the hole on the stem, back into the hole and keep a loop, then come up through that exterior hole through the loop, and then tack it down. So again, we're coming up, we're making a loop, we're coming up through that other hole into the loop to hold it in place, and we'll tack it down on the other side of our thread. And there are 4 little lazy daisies on this one to complete this little vine, and I think this is a really fun detail to have these details that are just stitching on these numbers. So once I get this one here, you're going to see what one whole side looks like finished. We have a leaf, we have a bud, and we have our little vine. So I will just tie this off, and then I will repeat this whole process on the other side. Now I'm actually kind of threading my thread down to where it starts so that my knot can be tied off where it started, and I'll trim off the ends. And then again, I'll repeat this whole process on the other side down there. So that's what this looks like. This one only happens to have one bud on this design. And now I'm ready to add my flower. So for each flower, there is a large petal piece, a slightly smaller one that layers over top with the petals shifted. So you see the ones behind between the ones on top. And I'm just lining up my holes, which I know is hard to see on camera here because this is such a small piece. Then you're going to take the circle that has kind of the pinking edge on it. And then finally, you'll have the smaller smooth circle, and that is the center of the flower. So I'm actually going to start by lining up the petal pieces with the holes that were cut into the number. I find it easier to line up just 2 pieces, and then you can see I'm threading on my center pieces once it's already on the number. Then you're going to do a running stitch around the circle, and I chose to go with a contrasting color, so I'm using the floss that matches the cardinal felt. And of course, I'm using 3 strands. I know I didn't say that earlier, but all of my stitches on this project are 3 strands of thread. And once I go around, you can see I'm going back in the other direction and I'm filling in all of those stitches. And we're going to get a contrasting circle right in the center of our flower. And then I can tie this off as well. And essentially, we're going to do the same thing on all the numbers, even though the arrangements are slightly different. So I'm going to skip ahead with the magic of a video, and we're going to get all of these done, and just look how pretty they are. So now we're ready to put our numbers together. And as I said earlier, the back is that lighter blue color, and then I've cut a cardstock core to go in each of these so that they are nice and sturdy and nice and flat. So we're going to have felt on the back, cardstock in the middle, and felt on the front. And I'm using the ecru floss, 3 strands of that. That is what matches my pearl felt. So this is where I'm pulling in the white color. Now I want to start my thread between the back felt and the cardstock so that the tail is coming out between that lighter color blue and the cardstock. And I decided to hold this together with a clip so it quit shifting around until I got some of these stitches in. And we're simply going to do a running stitch all the way around back to where we started, and then we'll go back the other direction and fill them in. Now you do want to make sure right here at the flower where it kind of overlaps the edge a little bit that you pull back those petals so you don't catch them in your stitches. So we're just going to kind of fast forward a little bit to where I have gone all the way around to where I started, and now I've gone back the other direction, and you can see how I'm filling in those stitches. We're going to get that white contrasting stitch line all around our number. Then when we get back to the beginning, again, we're going to come out between that lighter felt and the cardstock. This way all of our knots are on the back side of the number. So I'm tying my tails together. You can see I've got 4 because I did have to use 2 strands of floss. Then I'm going to thread that between the felt and the cardstock, which is really easy to do when you've got that cardstock in there. You can't really stick it out the front too easily, and then we'll just trim off the ends. And look at that beautiful number 7. So we're going to do everything that I just did to all the other numbers. So now for my star, just like everything else, we want to do those interior stitches first. So I will take each of these little triangles and line them up with the stitching holes that were cut into the star. I'm going to use that same ecru floss, again 3 strands, and we're just going to stitch up the center of each of these points to the outside edge. We're going to go back to the center of the star, and then we're going to stitch up the other side of this triangle. So each of these triangles will have stitching on 2 of the sides, and then when we get to putting our star together, that's when we'll stitch around the whole perimeter. So you can see I've gone up to the point, now I'm coming back down, and then I'm going to go up the other side here to the left, right to the outside edge, then I'll come back down. And I actually tied off after each of these little triangles so that I didn't travel around the inside of the star. So we're going to repeat this for all of those little triangle pieces. And this is what it's going to look like when that part is done. So now I'm ready to add my embellishment in the center. And like I said, the nautical star comes with a little circle and a tiny star, but I wanted these to match my floral details on my numbers. So I've just cut that single flower. Now I'm not using any holes to line this up. I'm just stitching this right on there. So I actually started by putting my floss through the front so I could kind of get it centered rather than trying to find a hole from the back side. But I'll pull that tail to the back side here in just a minute once I get a couple of these stitches stitched around this circle. So I'm just kind of holding that tail out of the way with my thumb on the front. You can see I've gotten back to where I started, so I'm going to pull that tail to the back. Then I can keep stitching back to where I started and then back in the other direction, filling in all of those stitches with that contrasting thread, and we're going to get that pretty floral detail in the center. Now there is a die that will cut out the guide holes for this, but I thought it might be a little too confusing with all those holes in the center of the star, so you don't really need them, but if you were putting this on a solid star, you could always do that as well. And here is that finished floral star, but you're going to see I added a couple more details here towards the end. Now to sew this one together, I wanted this one to have a little bit of poofiness to it, so I die cut some quilt batting with my basic star die, and I'm just using my scissors to cut off the holes so that this is a star that is smaller. You could also trace the inside of the die and cut it out. I do that often. But we're going to have our felt back, our cardstock core, our quilt batting for a little bit of puffiness, and then our front piece. And we're going to sew these together just like we did our numbers by starting our floss between the back piece of felt and the cardstock so that all our knots are on that back side. And I'm going to stitch this together just like the numbers by doing a running stitch all the way around to my start point, then going back in the other direction so I have a solid line of stitches all the way around. So here is where I've gotten back to my start point. Now I'm going to start going in the other direction, filling in those stitches where I've skipped them before. And then once I got my stars put together, this is where I realized I kind of wanted some little leaf details to make them match the numbers a little more. So I'm just going to stitch these like I would stitch them onto something with those 3 long stitches that all originate from that bottom of the leaf. And once I do that, I'm going to tie it in a knot on the back just gently. You don't want to pull it too tight because you don't want to bow up your leaf. So tie it in a double knot and trim off those tails as short as you can. And then glue is going to save the day. So I'm just making sure those tails are tucked behind there, figuring out where I want my leaf. And then I'm just going to add some tacky glue to the back of this. And we're going to tuck it right underneath that flower. I'm just going to use my tweezers so I can get in there without getting glue everywhere. And now it is all fixed. And I did the same thing with all the other leaves, so now my stars match my numbers perfectly. So here are all the pieces for the banner. We have all of our numbers and our stars. And now it's time to thread them together and create a banner. So I have some white thin cotton crochet thread. I have a very long doll needle here. You're gonna see this almost wasn't long enough for the sevens just because they're so long at the top. I had to use some pliers to pull those through, but I'm going to make sure I have a really long piece of yarn. You can always trim it down. It's really hard to make it longer unless you want to re-thread everything. So I'm going between the back felt and the cardstock. And I'm making sure that I'm going right in between stitches. So I'm kind of figuring out where I want that straight line to be. I can go straight across. And it actually makes it really easy because you can count down your stitches too and make sure it's straight. Now the 7 is very long. Every time I tried to grab the end, it kept pushing back in. So some pliers to the rescue so I could get a good grip and just grab it. It's not like it was stuck, it just kept pushing back into there and I couldn't get a hold of it. So for this one, I'm counting down, making sure I have the same number of stitches as I did on the first one. I'm going to use those pliers to pull it out. And then for the 6, actually to make sure it's in the same place because it's rounded like this, I flipped it over and now I can kind of visualize where that straight line will be and go between my cardstock and my felt. And then the last thing I need to add is the other star. I'll look at my first star to make sure that I'm counting down the same amount of stitches, and I add it in the same place. And since the yarn goes between the layers, you can adjust the spacing really easily once you hang it up. So here is a final look at my banner. I wanted something a little softer and more feminine than the usual stars and stripes. Hopefully this video has inspired you to make something for your home. Even if it's not red, white, and blue and Americana, I think you can use the ideas I shared today to create something fun for your home. Thank you so much for watching and have an amazing day. Happy stitching. Bye!